Good morning, everybody. Stella has just done a presentation which exemplifies what I'm going to talk about this morning, so I really want to thank you for putting into action some of the things I'm going to bring to you today. My name is Joanne. I'm a lecturer in inclusive education in the School of Education in Trinity College, and I'm about to give you my master's programme in diversity and inclusion over the next 20 minutes, so Trinity will be delighted to hand out all your documentation at the end. What I really want to do today is have a period of reflection for you guys and to offer you some of the kind of state of play in terms of the academic work, policy context, and just where the thinking is at around equality, diversity, and inclusion. I want to get behind some of the language that we use, because this language is used a lot, and what inclusion means to different people, okay? So I hope this works, but I'm going to ask you to go on to Slido, and the QR code is on your table. And I want you to just reflect on this question, top of the head stuff, don't give it much thought. Okay, so I'm going to call out some of these for those of you that can't see this. So this is fantastic. So belonging, fairness, no barriers, respect, conversation, how lovely, flexibility, bringing my best self, fantastic, accessibility, listening to others, acceptance of diversity, oh, I love it, not being excluded, brilliant, respect and celebrate difference, feeling safe, absolutely. These are really insightful. So maybe you guys are more au fait with this particular area than I've given this room credit for, because these are really in-depth and insightful comments around what inclusion means. And I haven't even said inclusive education, which is my area, just inclusion generally. Okay, so I don't know if we can capture that, but I'd love to include that as part of my presentation and maybe send that out to you as part of the slides, because I think that's a lovely kind of understanding. Yeah, sorry, I'm reading understanding. Actively not excluding. And I suppose the reason I wanted to do this at the beginning of this presentation was to give some understanding of the extent to which we all have different thoughts on what is essentially just a single word in our language as what inclusion means. And you can see it means very different things to different people. We can see there's definitely common strands and themes there, but everybody's coming at it from a different perspective. And everyone in this room is coming at life and how they go about their work and education from a different perspective. And I guess that's the premise of this presentation. That will keep going, but thank you so much for that. So we might go back to the slides then. Thank you. Okay, so today I want to just give you a brief overview of where we're at. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Irish education system, and I like to talk with my students in particular about history and legacy and the extent to which the way we do things today are really heavily impacted by the way we've done things all along and how that structures the way we think. And that's not coming at it from a critical perspective, that's just this is the way it is and where to go from there. I'm also going to talk a little bit about shifts or change in attitudes and how we view difference today and how we have viewed difference in the past, and a little bit maybe of discussion around how things might shape and change in the future. I'm going to talk about shifts in policy. I have a huge interest in national and international policy around this, but also we are working and operating within the context of a policy backdrop, and we can't ignore that. And it really shapes the cultural attitudes that I mentioned in the previous point, but also it shapes the way our government devise our education system and structures. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with basically the question of, can our education system ever be inclusive? Can the way we communicate, even on a day like today, be fully inclusive? Am I losing some of you in the room through physical structure, through the way I'm speaking, whatever it might be? Can we ever have a fully inclusive system? And I'll look at universal design for learning, which I know you mentioned earlier on. So a quick overview here of the evolution of the Irish special education system. So that's the term that we use and we still use today to describe a separate education system for students with disabilities in our schools. So if we look at the 3 blue boxes on the left-hand side, this is really devised by Swan back in 2000, which is basically the kind of evolution in the Irish context, which was starting off with the era of neglect and denial. And this I would align with this exclusion box here, which is people with disabilities weren't necessarily in an education system, they were simply at home and we didn't cater for them in any shape or form. Moving then into, say, the 1950s period, or even earlier than that, when institutions for the deaf and hard of hearing and schools for the blind were opening, the era of the special schools, where students with disabilities were educated in separate settings away from the mainstream. And this is a gesture now that we're in the era of integration or inclusion. The dots on the right are more international. You probably might be familiar with them even. They're called the inclusion dots. And it really moves from that whole exclusionary piece to the segregation piece, which is that special school piece, to the integration piece, which is, I suppose, some people would argue this is what's happening in Irish schools today, is that we operate separate settings within a mainstream setting and we call them special classes. And then the kind of destination is this inclusion, where all the dots, the students are educated together. And there's no need for a separate track or a separate system to educate students differently, regardless of their barrier to learning, disability or otherwise. I also know this is probably an international audience, so maybe just to give you an overview of the Irish education system, but also to reflect on your own system. So what does it look like? I can guarantee you it's not that different. So what have we done over time? We have our mainstream system and we have all our sectors, primary, lower secondary. We do our moving students into upper secondary where they do their leaving certificate exams. That's called the mainstream. But what's running parallel to this and has been developed over hundreds of years is the special school sector, the special education sector, where students are educated separately. We now have a new component in the mainstream, which is the special classes, like I mentioned. Then students then move into further and higher education, where they're probably in more recent years have more of an emphasis on a fully inclusive model. But we still have add-on services, still disability support services that are separate, they're retrospective, they're retrofit, if you like, to the mainstream. And then these young people move into the workplace, and what happens? Are there separate tracks? Are our workplaces fully inclusive? So I've done a little bit of work about this over the past with Professor Michael Shefflin in the School of Education. And it's to try and understand basically how have we responded to difference, and is it by exclusion and why, okay? So again, this is not to be critical. A lot of this is just, this is where we're at. Administrative convenience is something we've talked about. And what that means is it's often just easier to separate. The mainstream runs, you hear your comments like this, the mainstream runs easier when students are separated and can be given one-to-one or individual attention. Often change is really hard at a system or structural level. So it's really hard to bring people along and to introduce, okay, we're going to have a completely universal model here and remove any specialist supports. Would strike fear into most school principals, school leaders, or education principals or whatever. So there's that kind of, and also we now have a very bedded down model of separate and special education, which will be hard to dismantle. We have been expanding at a rate of, I'll go into the details now in a moment, of these add-on supports. And often this is really heralded, particularly in policy circles and by government. Look what we've done, we've just introduced this and we've added on this many SNAs this year. You hear these headlines all the time. I would ask us to reflect and pause on, is this what we want? And have we thought thoroughly about the actual education system? If we were to open it up in the morning, would we adopt this approach? And funding is a huge factor in this. There's a separate funding stream for how we educate students with identified and unidentified disabilities. So that's very much bedded down, and where there's funding, there's obviously people holding on tight to keeping that funding and keeping that sector alive. Don't get me wrong, this is a very contentious area that I'm delving in, and I'm really broad brushing it, but there's some of the key tensions that are being discussed at the moment. So I'm going to move on to the changing attitudes, because what's happening now, we're at a really crucial point in the Irish education system. We're at kind of, I would say, at the crux of change. So what's happening is that students are voting with their feet. The change is coming from underneath, okay? The profile and demographics of students, and I'm sure the workplace too, as people move through the system, is completely changing. And we are having to respond to that. And the student voice is becoming far more empowered. Simply not good enough for lecturers to go into Trinity College anymore and perhaps stand there and don't provide any additional readings or PowerPoints or recordings or anything like that. Students are demanding, hang on, I'm going to miss that class, can you please provide me X and Y? And that's fine. Also, I have just disability because the conversation has moved beyond that to other barriers to learning, and which often intersect with disability, as that's really evident in the literature. So sexual identity, gender, ethnicity, language, religion, and socioeconomic background. And none of them, they do not operate independent of one another. So yeah, I'll just introduce you to a graph that I really like to discuss, which is this kind of idea of the one-size-fits-all model. So our whole education and all your educational experiences, I can guarantee you, has been framed according to this power of the bell curve, this normal distribution where our education system teaches to that middle section. And there's some really lovely authors now that are challenging this and talk about this mythical average student that simply does not exist. And this one-size-fits-all curriculum suits nobody. So how do we educate based on a mythical average? What can we do? What we've done is we've separated out these poor performers or the high achievers, and we've altered the education for them in separate settings. Heavy administration, heavy finance associated with that. But as the demographics become, I wouldn't even say they've changed, I'd say they've just become more apparent, perhaps our education system needs to look at itself. So, going back to this, what can we do? There's two further things that I just want to talk to you about. One is the kind of policy shift, and there's a huge emphasis in policy, international in particular, going on with this at the moment. And the second is a pedagogical shift, as in what can we do? So in terms of the policy shift, this diagram, some of you might well know, and I think it explains this kind of equality, equity, and inclusion issue very, very well. So the first one here is basically the equality image. So equal access to learn for all learners. You hear this about the Leaving Certificate all the time. Sure, it's a level playing field. Everyone walks in there with the same opportunities. No, they do not. The second image is what we put in accommodations. So we have this equitable education system, and we put in accommodations according for students who need them. But we have to wait for the student to fail to identify that support and introduce it, and possibly separate or label or stigmatise that student in the process. Then the third is the inclusion model. We remove the barrier, remove the fence. And then somebody said to me in class recently, well, why do we have a fence? Why is there a fence between the student and the teacher? Let's just collaborate and cooperate here in how we learn. So the systemic barrier is removed. This is the dull bit of my presentation, but I just have to do it. So there's lots of international conventions on at the moment, but the reason I like talking about them, because I am a bit of a policy geek, but also there's a huge amount of pressure in Ireland, and I'm sure your own national context too, for those of you not from Ireland, to basically change national policy according to now what's been spelled out in conventions like the UNCRPD, where they've deliberately stated what the term inclusion and segregation means. So we've had to look and go, okay, maybe our education system just is not compliant with the stipulations and the arguments made out in the UNCRPD. And this has become really clear, and it really has mobilised, in the Irish context, it has mobilised the government, and we now have a review of the main Act for Special Education ongoing at the moment, and that's hugely contentious because of the issues that I mentioned earlier on. But I suppose in response to this, aligned with this is the student voice and the power of that voice, the increasing power of that voice, and it's that voting with your feet idea. Okay, enough of the problems. I'm going to try and move to the solution and leave you with some of this. So you hear the terms universal design for learning, multi-tiered systems of support, and they're all coming at the idea of inclusion from a similar perspective, which is based on this lovely image of the triangle, which I don't know how I'd describe UDL without it, really. And it's this base layer that's designed for both learners. And design is the key issue here, is that you assume variability in this audience group here, that you would assume variability. I'm going to criticise now, but my subtitling didn't work. So I had embedded subtitling in my PowerPoint presentation today. Stella very perfectly engaged the audience earlier on. I have quite colourful slides up here to engage with you. Again, I'm drawing on you, but you interacted the audience continually so that there was full-on engagement. But I guess it's time then, as a period then, just to reflect on, I'm constantly reflecting on how can I do more and how can I ensure that I have the greatest level of inclusivity that I can have. So with UDL, this base layer is key, where you wipe away, as is possible, as much as is possible, any barriers that exist. And the only way to do that is to reflect on possible barriers and prejudices and biases and privileges that you hold in terms of your communicating with whoever it is, your audience. The second is UDL does not remove the need for specialised support. It's really important to emphasise that. So the second is that group support still exists and that withdrawal support still exists once it's done inclusively. And then the top two layers, perhaps the yellow layer is often considered where maybe IT or that kind of tech, the old name of it would be assistive technology might exist. And then in the top layer, maybe it's one-to-one or very small group personnel. So that's where the expense lies. That's the areas that are under huge amounts of pressure. But I suggest that they're under huge amounts of pressure because that base layer, those barriers that are they're often very easily removed at no cost, could be removed, and a greater access to students and learners. So I'm now going to try and play a video, if that's possible, because they'll do a better job of explaining this than me.
Imagine you went into a big clothes store, and all that was on sale was one type of outfit, in one size, with no thought given to different individual body shapes or personalities. That would be crazy, right? Expecting everyone to be able to fit into the same size and express themselves in the same colour and style? Yet in many cases, that's exactly what is happening in our education system. When it comes to learning, variability is the rule, not the exception, and our college campuses are now grappling with the demands of an increasingly diverse cohort of learners, with increasing numbers of international students, students from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, mature students, and students with disabilities. Despite this, curriculums are still designed for the mythical average learner, and all are expected to engage and learn on the same terms. Not enough flexibility is built in at the design stage to give all students equal opportunities to learn in ways that play to their own strengths. So, how can our institutions respond to these challenges? Enter Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. UDL is an educational framework that guides the design of learning goals, materials, methods and assessments, as well as the policies surrounding these curricular elements with the diversity of learners in mind. The framework was developed by US organisation CAST and is based on research in the field of neuroscience. It promotes 3 core principles for educators to build into their teaching practice, calling on them to provide students with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework includes a set of guidelines on how you can turn these principles into practice, for example, by fostering collaboration with the introduction of group work with clear goals, roles, and responsibilities, by using different types of media to support learning and ensuring that all materials are accessible, and by providing a choice of assessment instruments while maintaining robust learning outcomes. You are probably already including some UDL elements in your practice without realising it, and there's much more to explore. So don't be afraid to let Universal Design for Learning give you a new lens through which to look at your teaching and learning practice and help you to better reach all of your students. For more information and resources, visit ahead.ie/UDL.
So the UDL model is really based on 3 principles. And the way I like to describe the 3 principles is that I'm here as the educator, as the speaker here today. You're the student in the audience or the listener or the attendee. So I have my way of delivering my message or information to you. And that under a UDL framework, I have to think of as many ways as possible to make that inclusive and engaging so that you have greatest access to the information available. I could have sent my slides ahead of time so you could have a little look at them before you came here today, for example. You have a video recording and a PowerPoint presentation afterwards, for example. Then there's the bit where we engage with each other. And this is what I mean about Stella's presentation. There was full-on engagement between the stage and the floor. And that's that engagement piece, where basically you kind of come to terms with the piece of information at hand through the actual learning that's live in class. And then there's in a student context, there's the representation piece. So it's how you show your learning. And in my case, what I've done is I give students multiple opportunities to show their learning. So to move away from the one-dimensional approach, in the past it would have been an academic essay, 3,500 words with a quotation and please discuss underneath. To change that up and think about how can students who perhaps aren't okay with writing, who maybe can't verbalize that way on a piece of paper, can you maybe offer a video submission or a podcast submission or multiple formats, multiple means of representation to do that? So that's a really terrible understanding of UDL because my video just didn't work. But you have to see that with UDL, you have to be responsive and you have to be able to overcome these barriers, and they happen all the time. We had to move room in Trinity the other day, and it was one of the most UDL moments because the technology didn't work as well. So I have a little job for you before I let you go for the day, and it's a reflection piece. So if you're interested in this area and you think you can incorporate it into your work life, you firstly, I think, need to identify the barriers. And it's not that you dwell on these, but for me, when I started UDLing my programs about 4 years ago, and I had to identify, okay, well, what are the barriers that I have for my students, based on basically what they get from me, in terms of how they engage in class, whether it's in the online format or actually physical engagement. And actually map it out and write it down. That's not easy, by the way, because you obviously often don't know your own biases and your own privilege. That you embrace variability. So I get a lot of teachers going, oh, if that one student wasn't in my room, like the room would work really well. You hear this a lot, and it's well-meaning. They want to help the young person in question, but it's to use that young person as a leverage for change. So that each year that you incorporate something new based on a level of need in your classroom. So say if you have a student with, I don't know, additional learning needs of some nature in your class, that you use that as an opportunity to make your class more inclusive, because you can be guaranteed if you modify how you teach and your pedagogical approach, it will suit 10 other learners in the classroom, not just that one student. So rather than separating the student out with specific supports, that you're actually changing it for the group as a whole. If you do that year on year or week on week or whatever format you want, you will have a really inclusive classroom environment once you listen to the students and take on board what the barriers they are experiencing. Reflect on our biases, and I think this is really interesting because nobody wants to go around and say I have biases, but we all do, and it's often it's well-meaning, but it's an important process. I think in UDLing, anything that you do is that you reflect on who you are, where you've come from, your gender, your colour, your level of privilege, whatever it might be, and your lack of understanding of some student circumstances, and that you take that on board. And often this is through that lovely collaborative relationship that you can build up with students and learners in a UDL environment. Amplify the learner voice. So this was really challenging for me because I hadn't kind of done it before. So you're basically, the way at the end of this conference, you're probably, how was your day and do you have any feedback? It's that you actually listen to that feedback and you take it on board and incorporate it into the next time you deliver whatever it is you've done. And they actually listen and go, okay, I excluded them. Not deliberately, but I excluded them from this process, and they did not get that higher level thinking that the other students did because I didn't facilitate something. With UDL, it's really important that you don't jump into it and try and do everything at once. It's a real +1 approach. It's real piecemeal, and it's the only way to do it, or you'll simply experience overwhelm and hopefully stop. The other thing, Anne and I and some colleagues in the school did this a couple of years ago, is to actually do it and take the action. And often that comes with having a community of practice to do it with. So I drew on my colleagues and I sent them, I'm kind of thinking of introducing this year. Do you think it looks okay? Do you think it would fly with the students? Do you think it's inclusive enough? And vice versa. So it's not that you're not able to do it alone, but my goodness, having that community of practice and other people and colleagues in where you work to introduce something new, even if it's something small, it's really reinforcing then you can do it with confidence. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, but if you want to know more, I actually have a podcast and it's called Inclusion Dialogue, and I'm really going to hawk it here today. But if you're interested in listening to conversations like this, it's when I basically interviewed 24 of the leading academics on inclusive education in the world over the past 2 years, and it's just a one-to-one interview. They're 20 minutes long. There's ones on UDL specific, and then there's ones on just kind of the dilemmas in our education system and what we can do to overcome them. And they're fantastic people. I learned so much from them. So if you do have an interest in this, by all means go on to Spotify and have a look at that. I have an academic webpage and I'm on Twitter as well. So thank you very much.